most of the labor was done by enslaved people, right? For the benefit of Southern capitalists. Poor whites were employed oftentimes as overseers. Largely, this was largely Irish workers were employed as overseers to control to maintain control over the enslaved population. So we kind of see where whites are deputized and employed as, I'm going to say, as police to police enslaved populations, and of course, red savages, if you will. That's indigenous people who were dispossessed of land. So both whites and blacks were exploited, and indigenous people were dispossessed of land. Right? Famous scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. Famously explained that working class whites enjoyed a kind of what he described as a public psychological wage, right? That prevented them from fully recognizing their own exploitation and common interest with enslaved blacks. How does that work? Well, okay, whites were given just a few kinds of privileges, right? We're given just a few kinds of like privileges that didn't necessarily translate into like better working conditions or better wages or things like that, right? But they were enough. They were enough to have whites recognize that maybe they were a little bit better off than blacks, and to foment resentment and contempt for enslaved populations, right? For enslaved blacks, right? And so this is what Du Bois called the psychological wage, because it wasn't actually like a real monetary wage, right? In the post-Civil War era, this is like Emancipation, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. About 4 million newly freed enslaved people, many of whom rebelled in what Du Bois called a general strike, right? So Du Bois, in his famous book, Black Reconstruction in America, which was written in 1935, he characterized the freedom, the new freedom and rebellion of enslaved people during the Civil War as a work stoppage, right? Because they were the labor source in the South at the time, as a work stoppage that undermined the economy of the South and allowed northern armies to prevail, right? White elites, of course, at this time still wanted black laborers, right? But many black people wanted their own autonomy, right? So white elites still wanted black labor, and of course, notions of racial inferiority are not just they don't just disappear just because the North won the Civil War, right? So, as a result, in the South, a whole bunch of laws were passed and local statutes were passed in southern states and cities, collectively known as the Black Codes. This is during the aftermath of Reconstruction, right? Where these were laws that applied only to like newly freed black people in the post civil rights era, right? I'm sorry, Civil War era. What they did is they criminalized certain acts, such as for blacks only. So this only applies to African Americans. They criminalized acts such as, say, not having ID, or being unemployed, and or vagrancy laws, which were notorious, assembling outside of white supervision, and even adultery, right? They would even, they even criminalized adultery for blacks, where, of course that was legal for whites, but it became something that blacks could be arrested for. And of course, after being arrested, the convicts, they were hired out of plantation owners and private companies. and ultimately overturned, and the 14th and 15th Amendment were passed. I'm going to say more about that in just a second. So the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, did not account for. So there's some loopholes in these Reconstruction Amendments that were that were created to establish the citizenship and legal protection of newly freed of newly emancipated and Black people, right? So what they kind of didn't do is they didn't account for things like poll taxes, right? That prevented, that worked to prevent African Americans from voting, right? So, a poll tax is basically a tax for voting, right? And that made it too costly for large numbers of African Americans to vote, right? Arbitrary kinds of literacy tests, right? That were, which also severely limited numbers of Black voters, right? So this is about taking away the Black political power, or preventing the emergence of Black political power in the immediate post-Reconstruction era. And of course, it didn't account for the fact that for Blacks, they weren't, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were in many ways not enforced, right? And of course, the more African Americans, more gains that African Americans made, the more backlash came through racial segregation and the uneven enforcement of laws, including, of course, convicts, of course, had no rights, and imprisonment for debt. So I want to say a lot more about this. I'm actually going to show this video. This is about the emergence of the convict leasing system. It's just a tiny short, it's very short video that just kind of explains what the convict leasing system is. It's pretty good. Okay, so of course the convict leasing system is a system that emerged in the South immediately after Reconstruction that exploited the punishment for a crime, the punishment for a crime clause in the 13th Amendment. Mostly Black men were arrested, for minor crimes like vagrancy or violating other kinds of Black codes, and then they were leased to plantations and other businesses, effectively using the criminal legal system to re-enslave them. This is a practice that was not fully eliminated until about the 1920s. I'm going to play the video. Hopefully, we'll be able to check it out.
The labor system took shape in the...
Can y'all hear that? Say yes if you can hear it.
Yes. Late 19th century.
You can hear it? Cool. Okay. Really cool.
Developed coercive means to ensure that cotton remained king. It was called convict leasing. Get arrested on a minor charge or a trumped-up charge, you could find yourself locked up and then hired out to a corporation bidding on inmate labor. The pipeline from prisons to profits in this country has deep roots.
The aftermath of slavery was in some ways worse than slavery itself. Unlike before, when someone who owned you, driving you too hard was counterproductive because you would lose your investment, convict leasing was different. You could get them cheaper, and if you actually drove them to death, there was more where that came from.
In the 13th Amendment, which ends the institution of slavery, of course, there is a loophole. Convicts who have been convicted of a crime, they actually can be forced to work for free.
In Alabama in 1850, 99% of the people who were incarcerated were whites. In Alabama by the 1880s, 85% of the people incarcerated were Black. So we could have a debate about how many of those Black people were actually innocent, or we could have a conversation about the use of the criminal justice system to target both the innocent and the guilty alike. That continues all the way to the present, where even today, about just under 40% of the nation's prisoners are Black, and yet the African-American population is about 13%. They are snatching up bodies everywhere to fuel the system.
The idea in which more money can be made out of their incarceration is still very much part of our criminal justice system.
Okay, I mean, that's a quick and dirty kind of explanation.
The labor system that took shape in the late 19th century developed coercion.
Okay, quick explanation of the convict leasing system, right? And just as the video, just as the commenters in the video say, it is true that there is absolutely, sometimes it's direct and sometimes less so, but there is absolutely an financial incentive, an economic incentive for the maintenance and perhaps the growth of the criminal justice system in the U.S. And of course and particularly around the criminalization of Black and brown people, right? Today we might go even further and say that there's now an economic incentive in reforming the criminal justice system, not necessarily in a way that, but not necessarily in ways that lead to greater human freedom. So, we will say more about that in a little bit. Okay, so moving forward to the Jim Crow era, and so this is like the late 1800s to about the late 1960s. So populists, okay, the term populism has an interesting history, but essentially what populists are working class, are people who are aligned against however the term elites is defined, right? So in this era, populists sought to unite poor whites and poor blacks, and they criticized like the railroads and banks and other companies that profited from convict labor, right? That sounds really progressive, and in some ways it is, right? The movement, however, was eventually undermined, it was eventually undermined by the state and large private interests, right, and industrial capitalists, right, and some white leaders, such as like the Parchman Farm warden and future Mississippi governor James K. Vardaman, emerged as racist defenders of white labor, right? Just a tiny bit about James K. Vardaman, right? He was the first warden of Parchman Farm, which today is known as Mississippi State Penitentiary, right? It is a prison farm established on a plantation, right, where prisoners to this day are worked as field hands just like during slavery, where prisoners are worked as field hands, right? And it sells the things that are grown, the produce that's grown on Parchman Farm. It's sold on the private market so this is money made for the state through prison labor, right? So James K. Vardaman, who became the governor of Mississippi in the early 1900s. Right. He basically, one of the reasons why he kind of championed getting rid of the convict leasing system, right, and establishing a kind of state imprisonment and state labor system that emerged at Parchman Farm, because he did not want the imprisonment and leasing of Black people to private industry to get in the way to undermine white labor, right? Because they saw that as poor whites not getting jobs because of Black imprisoned labor. Right, so that's a kind of weird kind of history of the decline of convict leasing, right? Labor organizing labor organizing that ununited whites and Blacks was thoroughly defeated with massive state violence, right? Jim Crow laws. And so these are all links that are in blue. Jim Crow laws effectively drove a wedge between poor whites and Blacks, because what they did, so oftentimes we think of Jim Crow laws as like, oh, well, these were laws that kind of undermined Blacks' ability to do things like vote and all of that kind of stuff. But let's talk about what the effect of Jim Crow laws were. And what they did was they drove a wedge between poor whites and Blacks by mandating segregation and giving whites basic kind of social privileges that were denied to blacks, right? This undermined the ability of blacks and whites to form coalitions to fight against their, collective exploitation. Right. So we can look at the emergence of Jim Crow laws as a way of defeating populism. Right. After the Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 that created the separate but equal doctrine, Jim Crow quickly became seen as the natural order in many southern states, very similar to the way that slavery was kind of thought of as kind of like the natural order, right? And of course, Jim Crow lasted all the way through from the late 1800s all the way through the late 1960s. Hold on, somebody mute their microphone. During the Civil Rights era, right? During the Civil Rights era, civil rights reformers during the 60s and the 70s also sought economic justice and to unite poor whites and blacks, right? This is so notice where I'm going here, that prison, that the criminal justice system is simultaneously used as a kind of wedge against poor whites and blacks, and is also used to kind of justify those divisions by suggesting that by depicting blacks as criminal. Right. So civil rights reformers during the 60s and 70s also sought economic justice and to unite poor whites and blacks. Economic elites intervened in economic justice by using Jim Crow laws to separate the whites and blacks. And one of the ways in which they did this that they worked to foster rumors that black activism, such as the later activism of Martin Luther King around economic justice, right? But also for civil rights, right? That these civil rights activists were criminals, right? Who were who were fomenting the breakdown of law and order, right? By upsetting the natural order, if you will. So politicians, such as Alabama Governor George Wallace, right? Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, of course, who became president, and Ronald Reagan, who during the 1960s was the governor of California. They talked about law and order discourse. Notice we hear a lot about that law and order discourse. We heard a lot about that in the past few years from Donald Trump, right? In many ways, he was very much a kind of Goldwater, Nixon, Reagan figure in that way. They promoted this in their federal campaigns, right? Locally, groups like the New York City's Policemen's Benevolent Association, it's kind of like the police union in New York City, promote law and order politics as well. Right. This is the idea the idea is about depicting activism and protest as criminal. And because it upsets supposed law and order. The purpose of law and order rhetoric was to depict civil rights protesters such as the Black Panther Party as criminals who were disrupting the law and causing unnecessary disruption, right? During the 60s and 70s, big cities like New York City, Chicago, LA, they experienced economic decline due to deindustrialization, of course, white flight and capital flight. Remember, this is the era of the fiscal crisis and the urban crisis. And so although the crime rate didn't necessarily grow significantly during that time, violent crime rates did grow in some big cities, and which, of course, this exacerbated popular fears of cities, right? And so we talked a little bit about this during the discussion of the urban crisis and the fiscal crisis, and a little bit also when we talked about public space. Remember Donald Trump's full-page ad in the Daily News, right, about bringing back police, right? So political leaders like Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democrat, and Richard Nixon, who was a Republican, of course, framed urban crime as a racial problem rather than a problem of poverty and disinvestment during this time, right? So Richard Nixon was famously like, the problem really is like the blacks, right? And even Lyndon Johnson, and even Lyndon Johnson before him, made the mistake, if you will, or maybe not mistake, who knows, of depicting urban crime as something that was racialized because of the large numbers of poor and working class blacks and Latinos in places like New York City or whatever, in big cities at the time, right? So rather than so they depicted it as kind of a racial problem instead of what it was, a problem of poverty and disinvestment. And so while liberals promoted a kind of dual approach that boosted police and social programs, right? So those kind of like, we're going to tackle it on both ends with more police and social programs that, targeting and aimed at benefiting the poor and working classes. Conservatives, they preached more about police, right? Because that was very popular with their constituencies, but they claimed that social programs were a waste of resources, right? That was kind of Richard Nixon's claim that social programs were a waste of resources, and what we need to control those black people in big cities, we need to take back our cities with more police, right? We see some of that rhetoric in the form of Republicans like or turned Republicans like Rudy Giuliani. And we also see, in Republican mayoral candidate Curtis Sliwa, who was the founder of the, I'm struggling to think of the name. Somebody put it in the chat. I can't think of the name of the organization right this second. So somebody remind me in the chat or say it. Rhetoric that linked poverty and crime with blackness and behavior became dominant with the rise of conservatives like Nixon and Reagan, right? So that was a big thing that Reagan and Nixon pushed, right? Both Democrats and Republicans passed a series of laws and initiatives that were not explicitly racist, but they targeted blacks unfairly because they had racist effects, right? So, of course, chief among those is in 1973, Nelson Rockefeller of New York, the governor of New York in 73, signed the Rockefeller drug laws, which mandated prison sentences of 15 years to life for drug dealers and addicts, even those caught with small amounts of like marijuana, cocaine, and heroin, right? So this was a kind of the creation of mandatory minimums around drug possession and drug dealing, right? Let's see. Nixon, for his part, called for a war on drugs, and Ronald Reagan eventually funded a federal initiative to incentivize local police to prioritize drug arrests. Right. So there was early on, conservatives. Hold on, Delroy. I'm going to say more about that in just a minute. So hold on. It's coming, right? But right this second, we're actually still in like the 1970s and the 1980s, right? So all the while, decline in jobs available to black men in cities, due to deindustrialization and fiscal austerity, right? So there's kind of, at the same time, there's kind of a decline in jobs and economic wherewithal for particularly black men in cities. At the same time that this is going on, Republicans like Richard Nixon and first and early on, and Ronald Reagan later on, were finding ways to funnel money into increasing police forces in those same urban areas, right? So, so we're seeing this kind of the use of the tough on crime movement and where that actually goes. So, Delroy, here you go. In 1994, Bill Clinton, you see, I'm throwing y'all's current president in there too, right? Signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of '94. Okay, this is the famous Clinton crime bill, right? And it did a few kind of major things. It included a 3 strikes you're out provision and so this was meant to address repeat offenders, right? If you were convicted of 3 felonies, right, then you would be then upon your conviction of the 3rd felony, you would be sent to prison for life, right? There was a kind of mandatory life sentence for those who did 3 felonies, right? Committed 3 felonies and were convicted, right? But the way that was kind of enforced, it's not like, don't think of it like, I robbed a bank. I robbed a bank and then I got, and I served time and then, a little bit of time and then got off. And then I don't know, I robbed somebody and then I murdered somebody later on or whatnot. And now I got 3 offenses. And now on that 3rd offense, I go to, no, what prosecutors would do is that they would stack charges on top, felony charges on top of one another in an attempt to knock out all 3 strikes within one offense, right? So, for instance, let's say if I was carrying a gun and I was robbing somebody, well, then those are 2. If you will, those are 2 strikes, right? And let's say that, a police officer was hurt chasing me, fell and hurt himself chasing me or whatever. Well, in that case, remember that I'm accountable for whatever happens to somebody as a result of my crime, right? So that's the 3rd offense, and therefore, all in one offense, that a person could be sent to prison for life, right? So it didn't work quite the way that one might assume that it does. They added 50 new federal offenses. These are federal offenses, including making gang membership illegal, right? So it's a federal offense, at least at the time, to be a member of a gang. The question is, how does one determine whether or not you are a member of a gang or not, right? That becomes kind of murky, right? And also, it kind of goes against the notion of free association, right? Being a member of a gang does not necessarily mean that one is doing something illegal. And also, oftentimes, people join gangs for the purpose of protecting themselves in a lawless context, right? It eliminated Pell Grants for higher education for inmates, right? So undermining the ability of prison inmates to be able to do things like go to college, right, while they're in prison to possibly better their life chances once they get out. It allocated billions of dollars to build new prisons, right? It combined mandatory minimum sentences and 3-strike laws. Those combined, it took discretionary power away from judges. So now judges couldn't necessarily make decisions about based on the circumstances of a particular case, and they shifted power to prosecutors, who decided who to charge with what crimes. And remember, prosecutors are voted on, right? The prosecutors are voted on, and in that way, maybe one can look tough. It never looks good to not look tough on crime if you're a prosecutor, right? Famous, right? That's why Kamala Harris was taken to task for some of the foolishness that she did in California, because she was a prosecutor. Rudy Giuliani was also a prosecutor. Both of them burnished their electability on the fact that they were on them being tough on crime, right? And once found guilty, often through coercive plea deals, the defendant's fate was out of the hands of judges, right? Okay, so maybe what some of us have been waiting for. This is a short clip of Senator Joe Biden in '94. He strongly endorsed the '94 crime bill. He claims to have had a significant hand in